J. Arthur Pritzker was an American businessman and philanthropist who became one of Chicago's most famous citizens. Born in 1922, Mr. Pritzker, for whom the J. Pritzker Pavilion in downtown Chicago was named, amassed a fortune during his lifetime as the founder of the Hyatt hotel chain of hotels, the Hyatt Hotels. At his death in 1999, Mr. Pritzker's estate was valued at $15 billion. Turn to somebody next to you and say, that's a lot of money. His intention was that his remaining family members would co-manage his business assets. In 2002, his niece, Liesl Ann Pritzker, filed a $6 billion lawsuit against her father, Robert Pritzker, and her 11 older cousins, claiming that they had illegally taken money from trust funds which belonged to Liesl and her brother, Matthew. The dispute worked its way through the court system over the next 3 years, until finally the lawsuit was settled in 2005, with Liesl and Matthew both receiving $500 million, while releasing all further claims on the family's assets, which were divided among the other 11 Pritzker family members. This is just one example of how the death of a wealthy individual can lead to quarreling within the family as descendants fight to claim a piece of the pie. You know what I'm talking about, church? These kinds of family conflicts have taken place throughout our world's history. And you know, it was no different in Bible times. Think about the story of Jacob and Esau, in which Jacob persuades his brother to give up his birthright for a bowl of stew, and then tricks their father Isaac into blessing him instead of Esau. Think also of the family conflict which followed the death of King Solomon, as his sons quarreled over who was the rightful heir to the king's throne. A conflict which ultimately led to the division and downward spiral of the Israelite kingdom. Are you following me this morning, church? In Luke chapter 12, I want you to turn your Bibles right now to Luke chapter 12. That's where we're going to be this morning. In Luke chapter 12, we are introduced to what also appears to be a family conflict having to do with money. In this passage, we find Jesus speaking to a large crowd of people. And beginning in verse 13, as Jesus is speaking, someone in the crowd says to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." The man's request indicates that there's a disagreement between him and his brother regarding the family inheritance. Now, we must keep in mind that this person who's talking to Jesus is not necessarily being greedy. He may actually have a legitimate claim to a portion of the inheritance and may be seeking a fair distribution of the family assets in accordance with the law. Perhaps this man simply wants what is rightfully his, and his brother is a greedy one. Are you hearing me this morning, church? I mean, who knows? Maybe the man needs the money to pay off debts or to deal with a family crisis. So in at least one sense, the man is simply doing what our culture says he's supposed to do. Get as much as you can, whenever you can, however you can. Are you hearing me this morning, church? So whatever his motivation is, this man appeals to Jesus to resolve the conflict between him and his brother. Note that the man refers to Jesus as teacher or rabbi. Since Jesus was considered a rabbi by those who followed him, the man's request in Luke chapter 12 is not out of the ordinary, because in Jesus' day, rabbis were often consulted to settle these types of disputes because they knew the Jewish law and they could be expected to judge fairly and impartially. But in this instance, Jesus decides he doesn't want to play along. Look how Jesus responds in verse 14. But he said to him, Jesus speaking to this man, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" You see, Jesus' response suggests that he isn't content to be seen as a rabbi in the traditional sense. Jesus understands that the heirs of an estate often seize the opportunity to grab as much as they can. Jesus also understands that people have a tendency to use religion for selfish purposes. Are you hearing me this morning, church? See, through his response, Jesus is saying to this man, I'm not going to let you use me as a tool in your quest for wealth, status, and success, which is how religion and religious leaders are often used. Are you following me this morning, church? Jesus is saying, I'm not here to validate your pursuit of earthly riches. I'm not willing to play that role. It is not part of my purpose. My life serves a bigger purpose than resolving disputes over money. Are you hearing me today, church? Then Jesus turns his attention once again to the crowd of people gathered around him. And he says to them in verse 15, take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. It's a statement which does more than just condemn the greedy. It also raises the question, what does life consist in? Or simply stated, what is life all about? And then Jesus tells his listeners a story. He starts it off in verse 16 with these words. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. Somebody say abundantly. And he thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. You see, the text implies that this rich man is a landowner who farms his land, and year after year, he has experienced plentiful harvests and has become wealthy as a result. Now, most of us probably realize that a farmer's success is completely dependent upon what? The weather and other circumstances that are beyond his control. Am I right? And that having a good harvest depends largely upon what most people would think of as good fortune or luck. See, farmers work the land throughout the spring and summer months, hoping to get a decent harvest in the fall. And sometimes they are fortunate enough to get a better than expected harvest. When this happens, they may sell some of the excess, but they will often store much of it in case future harvests are not as plentiful. Are you following me this morning, church? Yet in the story that Jesus tells, the rich man apparently has so much excess that he no longer has enough storage space to contain it. So the rich man has a decision to make. What should I do? He says to himself. Now look at verses 18 and 19. Then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. So the rich man decides he's going to save up for the future. Somebody say, save up for the future. And in our culture, most of us would consider saving for the future to be a wise choice, right? I mean, from our perspective, grain and goods represent basic necessities, which are sometimes in short supply. So perhaps the rich man is simply planning ahead in case something catastrophic takes place. Are you following me this morning, church? After all, you never know what could happen, right? So it seems to be a wise choice that he's making. But the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 19, the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. See, although the rich man plans to enjoy the fruits of his labor, his life will end before he has the opportunity. For shortly after the rich man reveals his plans, God reveals his own plan. What does verse 20 say? But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" See, from God's perspective, this rich man is a fool. Turn to somebody next to you and say, he's a fool. You see, the rich man has failed to account for the inevitability of death. He's a fool because he has spent his life accumulating wealth. He has made his wealth the sole focus of his life and his plans for the future. Yet tonight, the passage says, he is going to die. And when confronted with this fact, the rich man discovers that his plans have become worthless. Somebody say worthless. See, when he dies, the rich man cannot take his possessions with him, and he has no control over what happens to them. Am I right about that, church? The rich man is a fool because he has failed to realize that his life isn't all about him, that his wealth, his grain, his goods, his future, and his soul ultimately do not belong to him, but to God. Are you hearing me this morning, church? So it is, Jesus says in verse 21, with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. We could say that Jesus is telling this parable as both a challenge and a warning to his listeners. It's one of several instances in the New Testament in which Jesus seems to be especially critical of rich people, right? He seems to do that often. But in this text, Jesus isn't simply criticizing wealth or the wealthy. He is pushing his listeners to stop and think and to ask themselves, what is life all about? It's similar to what Jesus is doing in Matthew 6 and verse 25, where he raises the question, is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? You see, in Luke chapter 12, Jesus understands that part of his purpose is to make his followers re-examine their view of life, to challenge them, to go deeper, to warn them against a wasted life that is based on the collection and consumption of material goods. He's forcing his listeners to ask themselves, how are we spending our lives? Do we understand what life is really about? And when our lives are over, what will be the significance of what we've done? Are you hearing me this morning, church? You see, these are also the questions that you and I are being confronted with by this text. What's being called into question is our fundamental view of life and the priorities which result from it. And the truth is, for many of us, life is all about me. And it isn't only wealthy people who view life this way. You see, that me first mindset is firmly embedded in our American culture. Sometimes it seems as if life in America is essentially a competition to see who can collect the most stuff. In America, it seems that from the time when we start attending school as children, our lives are oriented toward acquiring more for ourselves. What do I mean by this? Think about it. As students in grade school, we can be made to feel as if just making good grades isn't enough. So we find ourselves competing with other students to collect accolades. Things like honor roll recognition, first place ribbons at the science fairs and the art shows, involvement in extracurricular activities, trophies at athletic competitions and band contests, the highest scores on standardized tests, valedictorian, salutatorian, and so on. And this competitive impulse continues nonstop into adulthood and throughout the rest of our lives. Are you hearing me this morning, church? See, here's what our culture says to our kids. It says you need to go to school so you can get good grades, so you can get scholarships, so you can get into a good college, so you can get a degree in a lucrative field, so you can get a high-paying job, so you can make money, so you can have a nice house in a nice neighborhood with a nice car, and then you need to keep earning more money so you can save up for retirement, so you can travel the world and go on cruises and do whatever you want for the rest of your life. And along the way, whenever there's an opportunity for you to have more, take advantage of it. Are you hearing me this morning, church? See, we're conditioned by our culture to consume, acquire, accumulate, and compete to collect stuff, often with little or no concern for anyone but ourselves. And when given the option of having enough or having more, we always choose more. You see, we go to McDonald's. Okay? And don't try to act like you don't eat at McDonald's, because I know you do. We go to McDonald's, okay, and you can get any size beverage for $1, right? They still do that at McDonald's? Any size beverage for $1. So you get a small, a medium, a large. Is there an extra large? I don't think they sell the super size anymore. Do they still sell a super size? Okay, for argument's sake. Small, medium, large, super size. Let's just say that. We know that a small or a medium is enough, but we're not going to get the small or the medium. We're going to get the large or the super size. See, in our minds, we're thinking, why would I get the small or the medium when I can get the large or the super size for the same price? Well, think about it this way. Why not get the small or the medium? Because that's enough. That's enough. But see, that's not how we think. We're always thinking, I'm going to get as much as I can for as little as I can get it for, right? We don't want enough. We want more than enough. And it's not so that we can share, right? It's so we can have more for ourselves. Okay? Do you know what I'm talking about, church? Why is that? You see, the more we get, the more we want. And what's the result of all of our wanting and getting? More often than not, it's discontentment. You see, too often, what we get is a temporary satisfaction which only lasts until we find something bigger or newer that has more memory or is better looking, faster, and then that thing becomes the object of our wanting. You see, too often we experience disillusionment when we realize that all our stuff has not brought us happiness like we thought it would. And then our disillusionment leads to disconnectedness from others, which then spirals into loneliness and perhaps even depression, which can leave us in a very dark and dangerous place. But it does not have to be this way, church. You see, what Jesus does is that he presents us with a new way of looking at life. Turn to somebody next to you and say, there's a new way. A new way of looking at life, which is summarized in the concept of being rich toward God. Somebody say, rich toward God. Now, what does it mean to be rich toward God? You know, honestly, I'm not completely sure, but I suspect that it's similar to the notion of storing up for ourselves treasures in heaven, which is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, verse 20. You see, for Jesus, the answers to our questions about the meaning of life can only be found by living a life that is devoted to God. A life characterized by loving and serving others. A life that yearns for a deeper connection with God, that goes beyond the need for material goods. Being rich toward God is a call to countercultural living, which is similar to what Jesus describes in Matthew 6:33 when he says that we should seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Are you following me this morning, church? Now, what does this look like in real life? I think Jesus gives us clues throughout his ministry. I think being rich toward God means loving our enemies. I think it means clothing the naked. I think it means feeding the hungry. I think it means welcoming outsiders. I think it means helping that family that's going through a hard time. I think it means grieving with those who grieve and fighting for victims of abuse and injustice. Being rich toward God is about orienting our lives around the things of God instead of the things of this world. Am I right about this morning? In other words, it means not being self-centered in our living. Look once again at the parable in Luke chapter 12 and notice, starting in verse 17, notice all the personal pronouns that the rich man uses in verses 17 through 19. And he thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years, etc. You see, the rich man's plans are thoroughly immersed in his own self-centeredness. At no point does the rich man consider sharing his excess goods with other people who have less than he has. You see, his sin is not that he's a rich man. It's that he's a self-centered rich man. The parable is not a critique of wealth per se. It's a critique of self-centered living. Notice the wording that Jesus uses in chapter 12, verse 21. So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves. Are you hearing what I'm saying this morning, church? You see, the rich man's response to having an overabundance of crops should be to share the excess, either by giving it away or even selling it would have been reasonable. Okay? But instead, he decides to keep it all, even if he has to build bigger barns to store it. The rich man never considers others. He only thinks of himself. Are you hearing me this morning, church? And to make matters worse, the rich man fails to display any sense of gratitude for what God has blessed him with. Instead, he acts as if his abundance of crops is the result of his own effort, his own skill, his own knowledge and expertise, when in fact it was God who sent the sunshine. It was God who provided the rain to water the crops. It was God who woke this rich man up every morning and gave him the ability to tend to those crops so that they could grow. It was God who did those things. You see, the rich man's problem is that he has placed himself and not God at the center of the universe. Church, when God blesses us with more than we need, we must think of others. Realizing that we have what we have not because of our own virtue, but by the grace of God. When we have more than we need, there ought to be this voice inside of our heads that says, I don't really need all of this. There should be an uneasiness that causes us to ask ourselves, whom can I share this with? How can I get this into the hands of someone who needs it more than I do? Are you hearing me this morning, church? You see, if the nations of the world would do this, if the ultra rich of the world would do this, we could end world hunger today. But what do we have instead? Instead we have our nation's president, I think it was the week before last, telling the United Nations that each nation should reject globalism and embrace nationalism. Basically that each nation should look after its own interests and just let those struggling nations fend for themselves. And maybe you agree with that, but to me it seems to be the complete opposite of what Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, where he says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility, somebody say humility, regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. That's what the Bible says, church. You see, as individuals and as a nation, we can too easily get caught up in the trap of self-centeredness disguised as frugality or being practical. We use the concept of saving for the future as a cover for selfishness and greed. Our excuse for being selfish is that we have to prepare for the future, save up for the future, plan ahead for the future. Let me ask you this, church. What is the future? I'm not asking you what's going to happen in the future. I'm saying, what is the future? What is it? You see, here's what I think. The future is our hope, our expectation that the life we are presently living will continue for some indefinite amount of time. The future is a mental construct that includes our plans and projections and dreams. It's what we think, what we imagine about things that have not yet occurred and in fact may never occur. Are you hearing me this morning, church? Ultimately, the future pertains to things which we do not and cannot know. As it is written in James chapter 4, verse 14, yet you do not even know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. That's in the Bible, church. You see, when we talk about the future, when we think about the future, when we plan for the future, we're making the assumption that our lives will continue beyond the present moment. See, that's what the rich man in Jesus' parable is doing. He's making an assumption. But what he discovers is that the future only exists in his mind and that all of his plans will never come to pass. Are you hearing me this morning, church? But you know, that's not even the tragedy of the parable. The tragedy of the parable is that planning for the future has kept the rich man from living righteously in the present. You see, as he has accumulated his wealth, the rich man has had opportunities. Somebody say opportunities. He's had opportunities to use his wealth to bless other people. People who don't have the financial resources that he has. But he has failed to bless those people because he's been too focused on himself. His life ends tragically because of what could have and should have been. had the rich man not been so self-centered in his approach to life. Are you hearing me today, church? You see, like the rich man in the parable, we all have plans, right? We all have unfulfilled desires. We all have a mental picture of what we expect to be doing with our lives at some point in the future. And there's nothing wrong with that. And no matter when we die, there will be something that we had plans to do, right, which our death hinders us from doing. That's just the way life is. But that's not the problem. See, the problem is that we can be so focused on our plans that we forget about, we overlook, we disregard God's plans. What does the writer of the book of James say in verse 15 of chapter 4? He says, instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will. If it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. You see, we can become so focused on our plans that we stop asking God what his plans are. Are you hearing me this morning, church? We can be so worried about whether or not we'll have what we need for the future that we ignore those around us who don't have what they need right now. There are people around us, church, whose lives we are supposed to bless. But we cannot and will not do so until we stop thinking only about ourselves. Church, I'm going to tell you a secret. God isn't concerned with our future plans. Think about it. In the parable that Jesus tells us, God isn't concerned with the rich man's future plans. God doesn't put his plans on hold so the rich man could fulfill his plans first, right? God doesn't say, okay, I know you want to build yourself some bigger barns, store all your stuff, then kick back, chill, relax. So I'm going to let you do all that before I call you home. Okay, cool. Is that what God does? No. God says, your time is up. You've had the opportunity to fulfill my purpose for your life, and now this very night, your life is being demanded of you. And the same is true for us, church. God isn't concerned with our future plans. God wants us to be faithful to him in the present, to love others in the present, to do unto others in the present. Now, don't misunderstand me, church. God is concerned about my future. Do we believe that, church? He's concerned about my future because my future relates to what I'm doing right now. He's concerned about my future, but not about my plans. You see what I'm saying, church? He's concerned about my future as it relates to his plan. What does Jesus say in Matthew 6:33? But seek first his kingdom, his righteousness, and then what? All these things will be given to you. See, there's the future right there. Will be given to you. In other words, God will provide for your future if you are seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness. Let us not be so focused on the future that we fail to fulfill God's purpose for the present. Can I get an amen this morning? What is your life? James writes. You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. How many of us can think of people whom we thought would still be living today, but whose lives were cut short? You know, just this past week at my wife's school, she teaches at a private school in Bridgeview. There's a student, she's a senior, excellent student, well liked by her peers and her teachers. Went to sleep on Tuesday night and did not wake up the next morning. just this past week. Now, I'm sure there are more details that have not yet come out, and that there's perhaps some kind of explanation for what happened. But my point is, church, that we can't allow ourselves to be drawn into this false sense of longevity, this false sense that we're just going to be here forever. See, that's what happens. We just keep making plans based on our personal desires. And then we put off doing the work of God because we think we have the rest of our lives ahead of us. And yet one day, like the rich man, our time's going to be up. What if that day's today? If your life ends today, what will we be saying about you, those of us who remain? What is it that you've spent your life doing? Are we living like fools? See, right now we're saying to ourselves, I'm not a fool. I ain't no fool. Okay. But are we living like fools? Are we merely living for our own personal fulfillment? Or are we living lives that serve a greater purpose? Lives that serve God's purpose? All the things that we've acquired, all the things that we've achieved, think about it. What will those things mean when our lives are over? You see, in the parable that Jesus tells, the rich man has spent his whole life storing up treasures for himself. It has become the focus of his whole existence. And what's his reward? In the end, what has it earned him? It has earned him the distinction of being called a fool by his creator. That's what it earned him. This wealthy man, whom the world would view as a success story, is considered a failure in the eyes of God. Are you hearing me this morning, church? Is that what we want when our lives are over? I don't want to be a fool, church. I mean, do you? Turn to somebody next to you and say, I don't want to be a fool. I don't want to be a fool, church. I want to be rich toward God. I want to be rich in the virtues that God desires for me to have. I want to be a part of what God is doing. I want to make a difference in this world. And when my life is over, church, I want to hear him say, well done. Not you fool, but well done. Isn't that what you want to hear, church? Church, as I conclude this morning, I feel that we are being drawn into a time of prayer, not just for ourselves individually, but for our church, for our mission in this community, for our mission in the world. Drawn to a time where we're being called to just listen to the voice of God, to the Spirit of God, speaking to us, telling us this is my will for your life, telling us to discontinue our pursuit of earthly success and wealth and riches and focus on seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness. That's God's desire this morning. Do we believe that, church? Church, I want us to take some time this morning. I want you to get in groups wherever you are. I want you to just group yourselves together, groups of 5, 6, or smaller or larger, and just spend some time in prayer this morning. You can pray for specific needs that each other might have. I want you to pray for this church, for our mission. I want you to pray for our city. I want you to just spend some time in prayer today and just allow God to speak to you and speak through you this morning. And then after a time of prayer, I'll come back and close things out, and then we'll be wrapping things up this morning. Amen.